I think Timothy may have had one of the most difficult ministries that there has ever been. Now, real ministry done authentically, has seasons where it's amazing and wonderful, fulfilling, motivating. But I don't care where you live, who you minister to, what your style is, what your calling is. There are seasons when ministry is really difficult. I mean, challenging is too soft of a word. Sometimes ministry is hard. I think for Timothy, much of his ministry would have been really hard. I have three reasons. One is, you think about Ephesus. See, Ephesus is where Paul had left Timothy to pastor and care for and lead a church there. Ephesus would not have been a cushy place to do ministry. Now, if you were a pagan, there were lots of things about Ephesus that would recommend it as a good place to live. Economically, for that time in history, they were quite economically prosperous. Socially, they were an attractive city. Religiously, they were a city that was significant among religious people, not Christians, religious people in century 1, because it was the home of the Temple of Diana. In the book of Acts, Luke records how Paul came to Ephesus, and he spent 2 years there preaching and teaching, and many men and women became converts. They repented. They turned their life away from sin and toward God. His ministry there was quite effective, but it impacted one group. It was more impactful for, and they felt negatively than pretty much any other, and it was the silversmiths. Here's why: because a large percentage, maybe the majority of their income was derived from the statues and the idols, physical idols that they created and fashioned and sold then, images of Diana, which if you can get to an encyclopedia online and you type in the goddess Diana, in my view, it's not a beautiful image. The images that have survived, and yet for them, for the Ephesians, it was quite beautiful, and it didn't have anything really to do with its simple, obvious physical beauty. But people came from really around the known world to get to the Temple of Diana. Now, you have to also realize that worshiping Diana was not like kneeling at an altar. It was not like throwing a couple of bucks in the bucket as it passes. There may have been worship, but it really wasn't, or music, but it really wasn't. It was nothing like what we think of as worship music. The primary way that Diana was worshipped, because she was a goddess of fertility, was by sex with temple prostitutes. I'm just thinking that would be a difficult atmosphere to try and keeping on with a ministry from the gospel and about the gospel, for the gospel. So, okay, I could go on, don't need to, about Ephesus as a difficult place to serve. In fact, I will go on to say a reminder in the book of Acts, the silversmiths became so upset by the fact that Paul's preaching and teaching had drawn hundreds of people away from Diana. Their income was impacted to the degree that they stirred up it wasn't quite a riot because there was no violence, but it was a huge and noisy protest. They filled the amphitheater. For 2 hours, they shouted, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." Well, okay, would have been a tough place to serve. Reason number 2. Have you ever tried to come along behind a legend in your career? That's a hard thing to do, unless you yourself are legendary. I think about college football, for instance, where a legendary coach retires, and most of the time, the next guy, he's a sacrificial lamb. It just happens. This happens in ministry. And legendary status is very relative, but there are legends in ministry, and to step in behind a legend in ministry, man, that's a tall job. This legendary minister, pastor, whatever title you give them, will cast a very long shadow for a very long time. Was there ever a more legendary pastor than the Apostle Paul? And now Timothy comes in, and his role is to follow Paul and lead this church in a city that would not have been easy, a culture that was not simply embracing Christianity. Third thing is, in that time, young people didn't get any kind of automatic respect. Respect had to be earned. Well, it's no different today, except it is different. In Timothy's day, you, at about age 12, the community began to expect you to take on the work of an adult. Now, 12-year-olds were not expected to work like 30-year-olds in terms of, but they were expected to begin taking adult responsibilities, but they were not given adult privileges until they were older. The things I've read lead me to believe that sometime around age 30, this ageistic respect was granted generally. Well, Timothy wasn't old enough to be granted this ageistic respect. I know this from what Paul writes in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 12. Don't let anyone look down on you because you are young. He was young. And I remember when I was young, it was a difficult hurdle to cross to earn the respect of the influencers in the church. And Timothy had to deal with that just like I did, day by day. It was kind of the never-ending battle. Paul goes on, and I'm just reviewing what we talked about. He said, instead of them looking down on you because you're young, set an example for the believers. And then he lists 5 ways that are 5 aspects to this example: in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, in purity. Your words matter. I've said it before. I made a big point of it. Our words matter. Timothy's example had to include his speech. Well, the second thing is conduct. And conduct means how you actually live your life. It's not rocket science, right? Okay. When you connect speech and conduct and they are congruent, that's when the best kind of ministry can happen. The best kind of influence comes out of both my speech and my conduct. I've known preachers who were not very good at preaching, but boy, were they good at living. They knew how to care for people. A friend of mine comes to mind, and he knows he has said it. I've heard, to me, he has said it. I'm not a great preacher, but he is a great lover of people. He lives his life in a way that the people in his community, they think of him as their pastor. And this is not because, he's the best preacher in town. No, but he may be one of the best livers in town. He conducts his life in congruity with his speech. Then Paul says, in speech and conduct, and in love and faith and purity. Okay, if you put love, faith, and purity together, you have what I think are three of the most essential ingredients for a life of congruity. Love, faith, purity. How do you express love? How does my faith demonstrate itself? And purity. When my conduct of my life springs from the purity of my life, this is when I'm most effective. Here's another thing about purity. Every believer, not just preachers, not just pastors, not just ministers, every believer has to confront the fact that my purity is the wellspring for my life's conduct. It's just like a well. You don't get clean water out of a dirty well. It's not possible. Your purity. Last time I said, think for yourself about your personal purity. And I'm not talking about a puritanical approach. I'm not saying don't be judgmental. Make an observation about your life. Are there areas of your thought life, your behavior, the places you go, the things you do, that need to be scrutinized for their purity? For most of us, the answer would probably be, yeah. Well, I have good news and bad news. The good news is God is not waiting for you to get pure in order for him to love you and bless you. His grace is for you. His grace goes out to and will wash over any and everyone. Your purity is not the point in God's grace coming to you, but your purity is one of the things that you have to be thoughtful and intentional about in order for his grace to go out in an effective way around to other people. So your purity. How do you, well, I don't have an evaluation scale. I'd be pretty suspect if somebody said, here's the way to judge that. But I do know this. When you said yes to Jesus and you followed him, He gave you His Spirit, and His Spirit will help you discern where the gaps and how to, in partnership with God's grace, how to apply His grace to those gaps.